Can Yaman wakes up to a new year bombshell, and from the very first hours of the year, nothing feels the same anymore. While most people welcomed the new year with celebrations, resolutions, and quiet hopes for change, Can Yaman found himself at the center of an unexpected turn that instantly shifted the direction of everything around him. This was not a rumor born out of thin air, nor a momentary media exaggeration. It was a real development, sudden and powerful enough to reshape the narrative of his life and career. The news didn't break with loud announcements or dramatic statements. Instead, it surfaced quietly, almost cautiously, through subtle signals that quickly caught the attention of those who follow him closely. A change in behavior, a different tone in his presence, and an unusual silence where people expected reaction. For Can Yaman, whose every move is often scrutinized, this silence spoke louder than words. It suggested that something significant had happened, something that could not be addressed lightly or immediately. What made this New Year bombshell even more striking was its timing. The start of a new year is often associated with fresh beginnings, but in Can Yaman's case, it came with a surprise that forced him to pause and reassess everything. Those close to him sensed that this was not just another piece of news to be managed or brushed aside. It carried weight. The kind of weight that alters priorities, decisions, and the way one looks at the future. As the hours passed, speculation began to grow. Fans noticed the absence of his usual New Year message, the lack of celebratory posts, and the restrained tone of his communication. For someone known for his strong presence and confident energy, this restraint felt deliberate. It was as if Can Yaman was taking time to process what had just unfolded before allowing the world to see his reaction. This alone fueled curiosity and concern in equal measure. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was far from festive. The New Year surprise had introduced questions that could not be answered immediately. Was it related to his career, his personal life, or a decision that had been building quietly for months? Whatever the source, it was clear that this was not a passing moment. It marked the beginning of a transition, one that would demand careful thought and measured action. What stands out most in this first phase is how Can Yaman chose not to rush. In an industry where instant reactions are often expected, he stepped back. This choice revealed the seriousness of the situation. A bombshell of this nature doesn't simply shock, it forces change. And change, especially at this scale, requires clarity. The new year had barely begun, yet Can Yaman was already facing a moment that would define the months ahead. For fans and observers, the question was no longer whether something big had happened, but how deeply it would affect him. The sense that everything is about to change wasn't dramatic exaggeration, it was a growing realization. This New Year surprise had opened a door that could not be closed again. And as Can Yaman stood at the threshold of this unexpected turn, the world watched closely, aware that what comes next would be unlike anything before. As the New Year bombshell continued to ripple outward, the atmosphere around Can Yaman grew noticeably heavier. What initially felt like a sudden shock slowly began to reveal itself as something far more complex. This was not a single piece of news that could be absorbed and forgotten. It was a development that lingered, forcing questions to surface one by one. For Can Yaman, the days following the new year did not unfold with clarity, but with reflection. Those close to him noticed a shift almost immediately. Conversations became shorter, decisions more deliberate, and plans that once seemed set in motion were suddenly reconsidered. The bombshell had introduced uncertainty, but not chaos. Instead, it created a pause. A pause that suggested Can Yaman was carefully weighing his next steps, aware that rushing forward could change everything in ways he could not control. The public, meanwhile, sensed this pause and interpreted it as confirmation that the New Year surprise was indeed significant. Speculation intensified, but it took on a different tone. Rather than wild rumors, there was a growing sense of anticipation. Fans began to ask not just what had happened, but what it meant. Would this news redefine his career path? Would it affect the projects he had been preparing for? Or was the impact more personal, tied to a decision that required emotional strength rather than public explanation. What made this moment particularly powerful was Can Yaman's restraint. He did not attempt to fill the silence with vague reassurances or carefully worded hints. Instead, he allowed the silence to exist. In doing so, he shifted the focus from speculation to significance. People began to understand that whatever had happened was not meant to be consumed as entertainment, but acknowledged as a turning point. As days passed, subtle changes reinforced this perception. His presence, when it appeared, carried a different weight. There was no sense of panic, but there was resolve. The New Year bombshell had not weakened him, it had challenged him. And in that challenge, there was a quiet determination to respond in a way that aligned with who he truly is, not with what others expected him to be. This period of uncertainty also highlighted something important about Can Yaman's relationship with his audience. Rather than demanding immediate answers, many fans chose patience. They recognized that some changes unfold internally before they can be explained externally. This mutual understanding deepened the connection between him and those who follow his journey. The shock of the New Year surprise became a shared moment of waiting, reflection, and trust. Behind closed doors, the implications of the news continued to unfold. Plans were adjusted, priorities reassessed, and long-term visions re-examined. The phrase "everything is about to change" began to feel less like a dramatic headline and more like an accurate description of the moment. Change was no longer a possibility, it was already underway. As Can Yaman moved forward through these early days of the year, one thing became increasingly clear: this bombshell was not an ending, but a beginning. A beginning marked by uncertainty, yes, but also by opportunity. The new year had arrived with a surprise that forced him to confront the future sooner than expected. And as the world continued to watch, it became evident that the next chapter of his story was being written not in haste, but with intention. As the new year unfolded, the impact of the bombshell in Can Yaman's life became more visible, not through headlines, but through patterns. The way he approached each day seemed altered, as if the unexpected news had quietly shifted his internal compass. This was no longer about the shock itself, but about how it was reshaping his outlook. The initial surprise had settled into something deeper, a period of awareness that demanded honesty, patience, and difficult choices. Observers began to notice that Can Yaman was no longer reacting to the situation, but engaging with it. There was a sense that he had accepted the reality of what had happened and was now focused on understanding its consequences. This acceptance marked a turning point. Instead of resisting change, he appeared to be preparing for it. The bombshell had forced him to confront questions he might have postponed otherwise, questions about direction, balance, and what truly mattered moving forward. In moments when he did appear publicly, his demeanor spoke volumes. There was no trace of confusion, but there was seriousness. A calm seriousness that suggested he was fully aware of the stakes. This subtle shift did not go unnoticed. Fans began to interpret his presence as a sign of strength rather than uncertainty. The New Year surprise had not diminished him, it had clarified him. Behind the scenes, the process was far from simple. Every decision now carried added weight. Choices that once felt straightforward required reconsideration. Commitments were evaluated not just for their potential success, but for their alignment with his evolving priorities. The bombshell had introduced a new lens through which everything was viewed. What once seemed urgent no longer held the same power, while other aspects suddenly demanded attention. This phase also revealed how deeply the situation affected him on a personal level. The new year is traditionally a time for reflection, and for Can Yaman, this reflection was intensified by circumstances beyond his control. He was not only looking ahead, but also inward. The bombshell acted as a catalyst, pushing him to reassess parts of his life that had been overshadowed by constant momentum and expectation. The audience sensed this internal shift and responded with a different kind of attention. The conversation surrounding Can Yaman became less about speculation and more about anticipation. People were no longer asking for details, they were waiting to see how this moment would shape his future. The phrase "everything is about to change" continued to resonate, not because of fear, but because of possibility. As this stage of the story unfolded, it became clear that the New Year bombshell was redefining the rhythm of his life. The pace slowed, but the focus sharpened. Can Yaman was no longer simply moving forward, he was choosing how to move forward. And in that choice lay the real power of the moment. This period marked a quiet transformation. One that did not need dramatic gestures to be real. The new year had delivered a surprise that altered the course of things, and Can Yaman was navigating it with a balance of caution and resolve. As the days continued, the sense grew stronger that the most important changes were still ahead, waiting for the right moment to emerge. By the time the first weeks of the new year passed, it became clear that the bombshell Can Yaman had woken up to was no longer just a private matter quietly unfolding in the background. Its influence was beginning to shape the narrative around him in a more visible way. Not through announcements or confirmations, but through the steady evolution of his choices. Each step he took seemed more intentional, as if the surprise had forced him to slow down and take ownership of the direction his life was about to take. What stood out most during this phase was the absence of impulsive reactions. In situations where many public figures might rush to control the story, Can Yaman did the opposite. He allowed time to create distance between the shock of the news and his response to it. This distance gave him clarity. The New Year bombshell had not stripped him of control, instead, it gave him a rare moment to regain it on his own terms. People around him began to notice that conversations were no longer about short-term plans, but about long-term vision. The surprise had shifted his focus from immediate outcomes to lasting impact. Opportunities were reconsidered, timelines adjusted, and expectations recalibrated. The sense that everything is about to change was no longer theoretical. It was becoming practical. Change was being built quietly, decision by decision. This period also highlighted how deeply the situation challenged his sense of identity. Can Yaman had spent years navigating success, public attention, and constant movement. The New Year surprise disrupted that rhythm and forced him to confront a different kind of question, not what he could achieve next, but what he wanted to stand for. That distinction made all the difference. The bombshell was no longer an obstacle, it was a mirror. As this internal process unfolded, the external reaction followed naturally. Fans began to see him less as a figure caught in a moment of shock and more as someone in the middle of a deliberate transformation. The attention surrounding him shifted accordingly. Instead of chasing details, people watched for signals of direction. Every appearance, every decision carried meaning because it reflected a choice made after reflection, not reaction. There was also a growing awareness that this change would not be reversed. The New Year bombshell had crossed a point of no return. Once certain truths are revealed, they cannot be unseen. Can Yaman seemed to understand this fully. Rather than wishing things had unfolded differently, he appeared to accept the inevitability of change and focus on shaping it in a way that aligned with his values. In this phase, the story surrounding him became quieter, but more powerful. The lack of noise allowed intention to take center stage. Can Yaman was no longer defined by the shock of the news, but by how he was responding to it. The new year had delivered a surprise that altered the course of his journey, and now he was actively steering through the altered path. As the days moved forward, one thing became increasingly clear: this moment was not about loss or disruption alone. It was about recalibration. The bombshell had challenged him, but it had also offered a rare opportunity to reset. And as Can Yaman continued to move through this period with focus and restraint, the sense grew stronger that the most decisive moment was still ahead, waiting to be revealed in the time to come. As the new year continued to unfold, the true meaning of the bombshell Can Yaman had woken up to finally began to settle into place. What initially felt like a sudden shock had transformed into a defining moment, one that quietly but firmly redirected the course of his life. This was no longer about surprise alone. It was about consequence. About how a single piece of unexpected news could force clarity where there had once been momentum without pause. By this stage, it was evident that everything was, indeed, about to change, not in a dramatic overnight transformation, but through a series of deliberate choices. Can Yaman had reached a point where reacting was no longer enough. The New Year surprise had stripped away the comfort of routine and replaced it with responsibility. Responsibility to decide what deserved space in his future and what no longer did. What made this moment so powerful was the way he embraced it. Instead of resisting the shift, he allowed it to guide him. The bombshell had challenged assumptions he may have held for years, pushing him to reconsider not just plans, but purpose. It became clear that the change ahead was not something being imposed on him, but something he was actively shaping. This distinction marked the true turning point of the story. Those watching from the outside could sense that a line had been crossed. The version of Can Yaman that existed before the new year was not gone, but it had evolved. There was a new calmness in his approach, a confidence rooted not in certainty, but in acceptance. Acceptance that the future could no longer be approached the same way it had been before. The bombshell had done what few things could, it had slowed him down enough to see clearly. As conversations around him shifted, so did expectations. People began to understand that the changes ahead would not be superficial. This was not a short-term adjustment or a temporary detour. It was a recalibration that would influence every decision moving forward. The New Year surprise had exposed what truly mattered to him, and in doing so, it had narrowed his focus. In this final stage, the phrase "everything is about to change" no longer felt like a dramatic promise, it felt like a reality already in motion. Can Yaman had woken up to news that altered his trajectory, but more importantly, he had stayed awake long enough to respond to it with intention. The bombshell did not define him. His response did. As the story reaches its conclusion, one thing stands out above all else: this new year did not simply bring an unexpected surprise. It brought a moment of truth. A moment that forced Can Yaman to choose direction over speed, meaning over momentum, and clarity over noise. Whatever comes next will be shaped by this decision, making this new year not just a turning point, but the foundation of a new chapter. In the end, the surprise that changed everything was not only what happened. It was what it revealed. And as Can Yaman steps forward into what comes next, it is clear that the new year did not catch him off guard. It awakened him to the future he is now ready to face.